Welcome to the Engaging People podcast. This is part of our series on culture builders. My name is Matt Wride, and Christian Nielson joins me as my partner.
Hello.
Today, we are going to take a little bit of a different path, and we're going to look at what we call founder-based cultures. And instead of highlighting someone really obvious, like a Steve Jobs or a Elon Musk, we decided to highlight Sarah Blakely. Now, Sarah Blakely is the CEO, the sole owner, the founder, the big kahuna at Spanx. And Spanx is a ladies' undergarment producer, manufacturer, very successful entrepreneur story. One of the first kind of solo women to become a billionaire, really successful, engaging personality. And it's a story of grit and determination, but we also learn how Spanx is really a reflection of Sarah. Their culture is pretty much who Sarah is. And so we thought we'd just jump in and kind of give a little bit about Sarah and give her story, and then we're going to talk about the lessons and what we think our listeners can kind of take away from this experience. She's from Clearwater, Florida. She wanted to be a lawyer, but the LSAT was a challenge, and after kind of failing that for the second time, she started selling fax machines door to door. She had saved up $5,000, and she wanted to launch Spanx. And so what she did is she was looking for a product to help sort of smooth out the dress, what women wear. And she took a pair of control top pantyhose and she cut the feet out of them and started wearing them under jeans and under pants to sort of make them lay nice. And she thought she was onto something. But she was 27 and didn't know anything about the business, had never sewn, didn't have a business class, didn't know much about the world at all. And so she started going around and just engaging with textile manufacturers in North Carolina. She just called on these various textile mills, and some of them condescendingly pat her on the head and send her on her way. Others would give her advice. And finally, she met one who took the idea to his two daughters, and he said, "Yeah, I'm going to help you do it. And it's because my daughters say you're onto something." And so she found a manufacturer. And it took her 2 years from that initial prototype to getting launched into stores. I mean, if you stop there, it's a story of grit and determination, but it goes beyond that. So just continuing the story, she went to Neiman Marcus, this huge name in department stores, and she found out the name of the buying agent and just kept calling and finally got through and said, "Look, will you give me just 10 minutes if I fly out and show you my product?" And the buying agent's like, "Sure, if you're willing to come out, I'll give you 10 minutes. So shows up, has her Ziploc bag of her prototype, and realized that during the conversation, the buying agent wasn't tracking. So she had enough courage to say, "Will you come with me to the bathroom?" And so took her into the bathroom, demonstrated the product herself, and the buying agent's like, "I get it," and place an order. And here she is. She calls back the owner of the textile mill and says, "I just got placed into Neiman Marcus." And he was dumbfounded. Like, that doesn't happen. That's something you work years and years to make happen. And all of a sudden, they're in Neiman Marcus. But that's not the end of the story, because she realized if she didn't show well in Neiman Marcus, it didn't matter, right? She would be a one-shot wonder. She could tell her friends that she had built a prototype, that she had ordered 1,000 pieces of inventory and failed. So she basically spent the rest of the time in Neiman Marcus kind of being her own sales agent. She would be in the store. She would talk to customers. At one point, she realized she needed to change the placement in the planogram, and so she bought displays, cardboard displays, set them up, put them around the cash registers and other places. And since she was always there, and since she sort of acted like she had permission to do it, nobody challenged her. So here she is moving stuff around, and eventually she started moving lots of product. And in other key moves, she was able to get this in front of Oprah, who loved the product and recommended it. And of course, that's an enormous validating recommendation. And then she decided to go on QVC with the condition that only Sarah would sell it on QVC. She's not going to, outsource that to somebody. She wanted to control the brand, the image of the product. So, in other words, Spanx culture, now as we turn to this issue of culture, Spanx culture is really a reflection of Sarah. And the culture may not be for everyone, but if you get Sarah, then you get the culture. So that's kind of just to bring our listeners up to speed. That's where we're at. So Christian, what do you do as you think about having a culture really intertwined with a founder? What are some things we ought to start thinking about as HR leaders and business leaders?
Well, first of all, I think it's been a lot of fun to just read up and study her story, because it's impressive for anyone to will a company into existence and to care about something, to come up with an idea and to see it through and just be undeniable in her efforts. It's passion and perseverance, the whole grit formula. She embodies it perfectly. And so, as you mentioned, as we're thinking through founders, it's an interesting thing to try to imagine being in her place, where you've built this company, you've had these major successes along the way, I'm sure a lot of setbacks. At some point, you've got to be thinking, who's going to love this company when I'm gone? Or who's going to carry on and take this in a direction I can be proud of when I'm not here, whether it's sooner or later, whether it's retirement or, after you're gone from this earth. There's that pivot point where hopefully those thoughts start to emerge, because she's built something special. And we don't know necessarily exactly what her succession plans, but it's an interesting case study for this conversation. When does a founder, or how does a culture live on when it's baked around a founder's personality and their love for the company?
You made a statement that made me laugh. You said, who loves a company more than the founder?
Yeah. It's like your kids. Who's going to love your kids more than you love your kids? Other people could be really great caretakers and things like that, but it's a different relationship. And so thinking through not only successor as the CEO, but who are going to be the fire tenders to keep that culture and to keep what's special alive when it's so much her own personality, her own soul in the organization.
Right. So let's jump in and talk about specific things we can do. So we know if you're going to engage in this aspect of succession planning, we think often that it's who's the next CEO, who's the next leader. But you and I were talking about who's going to be the keeper of the culture. How am I going to imbue this culture with me? What's important? And so point number one is you got to be deliberate, and you need to involve, this is an activity, if not driven by the founder should be an integral part of it. And if you look at Sarah, she has so many things that she loves, but one of them are quotes. She loves positive quotes. They're everywhere. And, you have to sit down and ask her, does that live on? How do you want to see that? What does that look like in 20 years? And so involving them and getting their perspective is key.
I like that you called out, as we talk about this, using slogans, artifacts, and stories to preserve. I think that's key. It's interesting. I like to use the language, you can tune a culture with the stories you tell, with the heuristics. When we talked about Danny Meyer, he had these little sayings. He would say, everyone here was hired to solve problems. These sayings that aren't about a specific action to take in a specific problem, but these broad statements that kind of help program the culture so people know how to act when it's unclear, when there's no handbook. And so I like the idea of what's Sarah doing that can live on? Well, the stories, the quotes, the things that she's saying and repeating live on in the culture even when she's not in the room.
Yeah, the commitment to the number of women leaders, the commitment to what the product should be and feel like, and the experience that the consumer has with the product. There's lots of bright red lipstick around. I mean, all of those things, they represent her, and thinking carefully and with her about what that looks like is going to be vital to keep the magic of Spanx, I think. Otherwise, it becomes just another product, and it kind of loses that connection. And we buy brands because there's an emotional connection to that brand.
And I was excited to hear that she's still the sole owner. It's one major milestone for a lot of entrepreneurs to sell their business and have a successful exit and let it live on in a different capacity. But there's something kind of cool that she is still involved and she is the owner, because it just kind of illustrates that I'm sure she's had lots of exit opportunities, but it's so aligned with who she is and her identity. But that's why I think we're using that as a succession and a culture living on kind of case study.
And this represents a great opportunity when you're thinking about succession planning in the context of a culture to sort of prune some of your nagging issues, right? If you've got some things you don't love, now's a chance to sort of talk about those, address them head on, and make that part of the transition. Would you involve anybody else other than the founder in this process? Who else should be involved in sort of this next stage of the culture? Does it belong to anyone else?
I think a lot of that depends on time frame. If, for example, we have to do this very quickly, then we might not have the luxury. But if it's a deliberate, over the next 3 to 5 years, we're phasing Sarah out, for example, and this new leader is going to take in, then I think there can be a really well-designed transition and an understanding period where you can go through a bit of a start, stop, continue exercise. That what do we want to make sure lives on in the culture, and what do we want to protect and preserve, as well as where is the room, anytime we have a major leader and any kind of organizational change, the disruption makes the culture a little bit more malleable. So there is an opportunity to change and to tweak and become even better. So to understand, well, what would we improve? And are there areas to even strengthen our culture and while preserving who we are? So I think a lot of that is the time frame of the transition. But I do think that it's a great thing if you have the luxury to do focus groups, to ask managers to capture feedback, to really just have leaders keep their ears to the ground, or have HR or someone else lead a kind of culture study and kind of transition exercise.
And in our business, I think there are 2 survey data points we would really rely on, and that's onboarding and exit.
Yeah.
And then possibly the surveys that some of our clients run, which are just with any of their possible hires. What is that employee value proposition? But those are good data sources because they'll talk a lot about culture in exit surveys, or they'll talk a lot about it when they're onboarding.
And again, we don't have all the data on this. Maybe it's available, we just don't know. But it'd be interesting if Spanx has a leadership competency model that's aligned with what Sarah's created there. Does the competency model, our leadership expectations aligned with the culture? You could do 360s to try to understand and reinforce a culture. And so there's a lot of interesting things you could do to deliberately understand and reinforce what's special about an organization to kind of help insulate it against kind of losing that identity.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And one of the things that Sarah's known for is these OPS meetings where she encourages employees to share mistakes they've made and sort of make them anecdotes that they can laugh at. Well, if that's something that matters, we need to build that in as a leadership competency. Right. Unafraid to make mistakes, willing, and you describe those behaviors and you start measuring. The act of measuring sends a very clear message that we value this.
If we're measuring it, if we're talking about it, managers know that, that's the experience I need to create for my team.
A couple other points. Just don't wait too long to start the cultural succession process. Don't wait till retirement or 2 months before retirement. Time it with changes in leadership, like you said, is a good chance to do that. And another point is that cultures are what they are. I don't suppose there's a right or wrong culture. I mean, there are certainly things we need for good cultures like diversity and equity and inclusion. One of the things I did is I just went on and just kind of did a Glassdoor review of Spanx. And it's not for everybody, but very polarizing. But man, if you're in, you're in. And that's okay. That's what culture's about, right? And it creates a tribe and a place. So
I've heard it described as a dog whistle. Not everyone can hear it, but maybe there's the best analogy, but it doesn't speak to everyone. But those that speak to it, those who get it, really thrive. And I think that's what a good culture does. It shouldn't be tailored for the broadest possible audience in most cases. It should be, this is who we are and how we're special and accomplishing something unique in a marketplace or fulfilling a mission. And this is what it feels like to work here. We'd love to have you if it aligns with what you're looking for.
Well, we've quoted Drucker before when he says culture eats strategy for breakfast. I was reading a story by Steve Kerr. He's the head coach of the Warriors, the Golden State Warriors. And he said, culture beats scheme. In other words, if he's got a great culture, it beats scheme. And all of this is about that principle that don't just think you can hand off your company and have it survive by handing it to the right person. Make sure that what you love and care about continues.
Yeah. Building a company is difficult, and then to make sure you're building a legacy that lives on without you is, I think, the highest form of that.
Well, thanks, Christian. Enjoyed the conversation. Enjoyed learning about Sarah. Hopefully our listeners take something away from this. If you have any suggestions, send it to info@DecisionWise.com, and we'll look forward to our next podcast in the coming weeks. Thanks, everybody.